She was a whisper in a house built of declarations. To the household staff, she was Maya, the American girl, a temporary fixture of dust cloths and quiet efficiency. To the guests who swept through the marble halls in clouds of expensive perfume and rustling silk, she was less than a whisper. She was an absence, a necessary function made invisible by her simple gray uniform. Her movements were a form of silent apology for taking up space, her shoulders slightly curved, her gaze perpetually fixed on the floor she was meant to polish. She traced the perimeter of conversations, the ghost at the edge of every banquet, her presence registered only by the sudden gleam of a surface that had been dull moments before. But to the grand piano that stood silent and monolithic in the western salon, a sleeping giant of polished ebony and ivory, she was something else entirely. In the deep, still hours of the night, when the mansion exhaled and settled into its foundations, she would sometimes pause in her rounds, her hand hovering just above the closed lid. She would not touch it. The space between her skin and the lacquered wood was charged with a history no one in this palace could ever guess. It was a space filled with ghosts of sound, with the muscle memory of forgotten chords, with the phantom weight of a life she had been forced to bury. It was not just a piano, it was a tombstone, and she was its solitary, devoted mourner. We all wear uniforms of one kind or another, don't we? Some are made of fabric, and some are made of expectations. If you believe that a person's worth is not defined by the clothes they wear or the job they do, then you're in the right place. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover the extraordinary hiding in the ordinary, and let us know in the comments, have you ever completely misjudged someone? Sheikh Khalid Al-Jamil moved through his home not as an owner, but as a current. Everything parted before him. Maids would flatten themselves against the walls, gardeners would cease their trimming, and conversations would hush, waiting for his passage or his command. He was a man of stark, elegant contrasts, the brilliant white of his thobe against the sun-darkened tint of his skin, the sharp black of his eyes against the soft, intricate red and white of his keffiyeh. His authority was not loud. It was a low, resonant frequency felt in the bones of the building itself. He had a mind that appreciated precision, in the lines of a German automobile, in the cut of a diamond, in the sharp, dismissive turn of a phrase that could end a debate before it had truly begun. He saw the world as a collection of assets and functions. The staff were functions. They performed their duties with the quiet, reliable hum of a well-oiled machine, and he expected nothing more. He did not know their names beyond their roles. Cook, driver, cleaner. Maya, to him, was simply the cleaner. He registered her as a sliver of gray at the edge of his vision, a necessary part of the ecosystem that kept his world pristine. Her humanity was an irrelevant detail, a footnote he had no interest in reading. His blindness was not born of malice, but of a privilege so absolute it had become a form of atmospheric pressure, shaping everything around him. One languid afternoon, the air thick with the scent of jasmine and cardamom-spiced coffee, Khalid was entertaining a small group of associates. They were men like him, accustomed to the world bending to their will, their laughter echoing off the high, gilded ceilings. Their conversation drifted lazily from oil futures to modern art, and finally, to music. A debate began about the romantic composers. Liszt's Fire versus Chopin's Soul. Khalid, gesturing with a delicate coffee cup, made his point with theatrical flair. Chopin is not about technique, he declared, his voice smooth and certain. It is about a pain so profound it can only be expressed through the keys. It requires a life lived, a heart broken. His eyes, sweeping the room for emphasis, landed on Maya. She was near the grand piano, her cloth moving in slow, respectful circles over its surface. An idea, cruel and amusing, sparked in his mind. He smiled, a flash of white in his dark beard. He raised his voice just enough for the entire room to hear, a performer playing to his audience. "You girl," he called out, the word hanging in the air. Maya froze, her hand still on the piano. "You seem to love that instrument. Tell me, do you even know what it is?" A few of his guests chuckled. He continued, enjoying the moment. "I will make you a proposition. A joke. For my friends, he leaned back, the picture of magnanimous, untouchable power. If you can play Chopin for us right now, I will marry you. The laughter that followed was not kind. It was the easy, thoughtless laughter of men who had never been invisible a day in their lives. It ricocheted off the marble and crystal, a sound that made Maya feel smaller than she already was. She did not flush with embarrassment or anger. A profound stillness simply settled over her, a mask of quiet deference she had perfected over years of servitude. She lowered her head, murmuring an apology no one was meant to hear, and retreated from the room, the sound of their amusement following her down the hall. But the word had not been Mary. The word that had pierced through the layers of her carefully constructed anonymity was Chopin. It was a name she had not allowed herself to think, a name that tasted of ash and memory. Years fell away. She was no longer a 19-year-old janitor in a foreign land. She was a girl of 16, sitting not at a concert grand, but at a worn upright in a small, cluttered living room in Ohio. Her father was beside her, his large, calloused hand tapping out the rhythm on her shoulder, his face alight with a fierce, impossible pride. Her mother was in the kitchen, the scent of baking bread mingling with the sound of the nocturnes, a domestic harmony that was the bedrock of Maya's entire world. They had sacrificed everything for her talent, the second jobs, the skipped vacations, the ancient family car they kept coaxing back to life. They saw Juilliard in her future. They saw Carnegie Hall. They saw a life for her made of sound and light. The memory sharpened, turning cruel. The rain-slicked highway at night. The blinding glare of oncoming headlights. The horrifying screech of metal and the sudden, violent silence that followed. She had been in the back seat, clutching her sheet music, on the way to the state competition that was supposed to be her final stepping stone. She had woken up in a hospital to a world without music, a world without them. The medical bills had devoured the small insurance payout, and the mountain of their debts had fallen squarely on her 16-year-old shoulders. The piano in their house was sold first, a gut-wrenching amputation. Her dream was sold next, piece by piece, to pay for rent, for food, for the crushing reality of being utterly alone. She abandoned her name, her past, her gift. She took the job in this faraway mansion precisely because it was a place of profound silence, a place where no one would ever ask her who she used to be. The Sheikh's careless joke was not an insult. It was an excavation. It had dug past the layers of grief and survival and struck the bedrock of her identity. That night, she did not clean. She sat in her small, sterile room, and for the first time in 3 years, she allowed herself to remember the shape of a C-sharp minor chord under her fingers. The Sheikh's words became a haunting, not the absurd, mocking proposal, but the challenge buried within it. If you can play Chopin. It was a question she had not dared to ask herself for 1,000 days. Can you? The ghost of the musician she was meant to be began to stir within the shell of the janitor she had become. The fear was a physical thing, a cold knot in her stomach. Music was her parents. It was the car ride. It was the silence after the crash. To touch the keys again would be to touch the rawest, most agonizing part of her soul. Yet, the challenge had also ignited a tiny, defiant spark in the frozen landscape of her grief. His dismissal of her entire existence, had unknowingly given her a reason to fight back, not against him, but against the silence that had consumed her life. Her transformation began in secret, in the dead of night. She would wait until the last light in the mansion was extinguished, until the security guards were settled into their slow, predictable patrols. She would slip out of her quarters, a shadow moving through other shadows, and make her way to the western salon. At first, she couldn't bring herself to touch the piano. She would just stand before it, breathing in the faint scent of lemon oil and old wood, letting the sheer presence of it settle her racing heart. Then, one night, she lifted the fallboard. The pristine, mocking perfection of the black and white keys seemed to stare up at her. Her hands trembled as she reached out, her fingers hovering, remembering. Weeks passed in this silent ritual. She started by just resting her fingertips on the keys, feeling no weight, making no sound. It was an act of reacquaintance, of asking for forgiveness. She traced the melodies in the air above the keyboard, her mind playing the complex passages of the ballades and scherzos her fingers no longer could. She was rebuilding the bridge between her memory and her muscles, note by agonizing note. She would sit on the bench for hours, her gray uniform a shroud in the moonlight filtering through the enormous windows, and she would simply remember. She remembered her father's voice, a low rumble of encouragement. "Feel the story, Maya. Don't just play the notes." She remembered her mother's smile, a quiet beacon from the doorway. Slowly, painfully, she began to press the keys. A single, hesitant note. Then a simple chord, flawed and uncertain. Her fingers were stiff, clumsy imposters. The fluid grace was gone, replaced by a frustrating awkwardness. But she persisted. Night after night, she worked, her only audience the portraits of Khalid's ancestors hanging on the walls, their painted eyes watching her struggle. She was not just practicing an instrument. She was performing a resurrection. She was calling back a part of herself she thought she had buried forever on that dark, rain-swept road. It was another evening of opulent display. A foreign diplomat was being honored, and the mansion was ablaze with light and sound. The air was thick with competing perfumes, the clinking of crystal, and the murmur of a dozen languages. Maya moved through it all on her designated path, collecting empty glasses, her face a familiar mask of polite invisibility. Sheikh Khalid was at the center of the largest group, his posture relaxed but commanding, a charming anecdote flowing from his lips. As he spoke, his gaze swept the room and, for a fleeting moment, it met Maya's. There was a flicker of recognition, a shadow of the memory of his cruel joke from weeks before. He gave a subtle, dismissive smirk, a silent reaffirmation of her place and his. But this time, something was different. The spark that had been ignited in her had been tended in secret, and it had grown into a quiet, steady flame. She saw his smirk not as an insult, but as an invitation. She placed her tray of glasses on a nearby table with a soft, deliberate click. Every eye in the vicinity turned to her. The simple, out-of-place sound was more disruptive than a shout. She turned and began to walk, not towards the kitchens, but towards the grand piano. A hush began to spread through the room like a ripple in a pond. Conversations faltered. Heads turned. Khalid's anecdote died on his lips, his expression shifting from amusement to confusion. She reached the piano and stood before it, the collective gaze of 100 powerful people a physical weight on her back. Then, she did something that seemed, in that context, utterly revolutionary. She slowly, methodically, pulled off her gray work gloves, finger by finger, and placed them on the piano's lid. It was a shedding of a skin, an abdication of her role. She was no longer the janitor. She sat on the bench, her back straight, her posture transformed. The chandelier light overhead seemed to narrow, the world shrinking to this one woman and this one instrument. For a moment, there was only the sound of breathing. Then, she raised her hands. The first notes that filled the hall were not tentative or shy. They were a storm. She had chosen Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a piece that begins with a question and ends with a furious, defiant scream. It was not music played for entertainment. It was a confession. It was a biography. The notes poured from her fingers, a torrent of everything she had held inside for 3 years. The opening was the sound of her grief, dark, questioning, lost. The lyrical second theme was the memory of her parents' love, a heartbreakingly sweet melody that spoke of a home she could never return to. The waltz section was a dizzying, frantic dance with fate, a desperate spin on the edge of a cliff. The room was frozen. A waiter holding a tray of champagne stopped mid-stride. A woman's laugh was cut off, her mouth still open. Khalid stood absolutely motionless, his coffee cup held halfway to his lips, his eyes wide with a dawning, shattering disbelief. This was not the playing of an amateur. This was the work of a master. Pain, love, loss, and healing, all were stitched into each measure. The music built, growing more and more ferocious. The finale was a cataclysm. Her small frame rocked with the force of the chords, her hands a blur across the keys. It was the sound of the car crash, the sound of a life breaking apart, the sound of a soul raging against the silence. And then it was over. The final, crashing chord echoed through the vast hall, a thunderclap of sound. It hung in the air, vibrating in the crystal, in the bones of everyone present. Then silence, a profound, absolute silence that was louder than any applause. In that silence, Maya took a single, deep breath. The sound was stark in the stillness. She did not look at the stunned faces of the guests. She did not search for Khalid's reaction. Her performance had not been for them. It had been an exorcism, a reclamation, a private conversation between her, the piano, and the ghosts of her past. She had played not to prove them wrong, but to prove to herself that she was still alive. The spell of silence broke. It was not a smattering of polite clapping. It was a roar, an instantaneous, explosive standing ovation, a wave of sound and emotion that washed over her. People were weeping. Strangers were embracing. They were applauding not just the music, but the raw, undeniable truth of what they had just witnessed. They had seen a soul laid bare. But Maya seemed not to hear it. The applause was a distant, irrelevant storm. She rose slowly from the piano bench. With a quiet, unshakable dignity, she gave a small, formal bow, not to the audience, but to the instrument itself, an acknowledgement of a sacred trust renewed. Then, without a backward glance, she turned and walked away. She moved past the frozen waiter, past the tear-streaked faces of the guests, past the man who had unknowingly set her free. She walked out of the salon, leaving the thunder of their adoration behind her, her steps as quiet and deliberate as they had been when she was just the invisible girl with the dust cloth. Khalid remained rooted to the spot, the applause roaring in his ears that he could not process. The world had just tilted on its axis. The neat categories by which he organized his reality, owner and servant, powerful and invisible, worthy and worthless, had been utterly demolished by a slip of a girl playing a dead composer's music. He saw her gray uniform, but now he saw it as a costume, a disguise for the royalty that lived within her. His careless, cruel joke replayed in his mind, each word landing like a lash of a whip. "If you play Chopin, I'll marry you." The sheer, staggering arrogance of it burned him with a shame so profound it was almost paralyzing. He had dangled the most valuable thing he could offer, his name, his status, as a cheap joke, assuming it was an impossible prize for someone like her. He now understood that what she possessed was a treasure beyond any price, something his wealth could never purchase and his power could never command. His friends rushed to him, their faces alive with excitement. "Khalid, who is she? Where did you find her?" He couldn't answer. He waved them away, his mind a maelstrom of confusion and regret. Later that night, long after the last guest had departed and the mansion had settled back into its quietude, he went looking for her. He found her not in the salon, but in a small, quiet alcove off the main corridor, simply staring out a window at the moonlit gardens. He approached slowly, his usual confidence gone, replaced by a hesitant uncertainty. He, who commanded boardrooms and influenced governments, felt like a boy before his teacher. He stopped a few feet away. "Why?" he finally managed to ask, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Why didn't you ever tell anyone?" Maya didn't turn to look at him. Her gaze remained on the garden, her profile etched in silver by the moonlight. Her reply was quiet, devoid of accusation or triumph. It was simply the truth. "No one ever asked." Those 4 words rearranged his universe. They were a quiet indictment of his blindness, his lack of curiosity, his failure to see the humanity in the people who served him. In the days that followed, a subtle but seismic shift occurred in the life of the mansion. Khalid issued a new set of instructions. Maya was no longer a janitor. Her old duties were quietly reassigned. Her new role was undefined, but it came with a new room, new clothes, and one standing order. The grand piano in the Western salon was hers, to be used whenever she wished. There was no grand apology, no dramatic declaration. The change was communicated through action, not words. The dynamic between them was transformed. When they passed in the hallways, The old hierarchy was gone. He would incline his head in a gesture of profound respect, and she would offer a small, quiet nod in return. The space between them was no longer an impassable gulf of status, but a silence charged with unspoken meaning. It was not the beginning of a fairy tale romance from his foolish joke, but something deeper, more real. It was the birth of seeing. He would often find himself pausing outside the salon, listening as she played. The music that now filled the halls was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing entity, sometimes sorrowful, sometimes joyful, always breathtakingly honest. It was the mansion's new heartbeat. Maya had found her voice again, and in doing so, had given Khalid a new way of hearing the world. He started to learn the names of his staff. He started to ask them questions about their lives, their families, their homes. He was learning to see the symphony of humanity that had been playing around him all along, unheard. Every person you pass on the street has a story you will likely never know, a hidden talent, a secret sorrow, a quiet triumph. Maya's story is a reminder that dignity is not something that can be given or taken away by status or wealth. It is a fire we tend within ourselves. The world is full of invisible people, waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. What would you have done if you were in Maya's shoes? Would you have walked away? Or would you have played? Let us know your thoughts below, and if this story moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it.